Hello, Gaston County. Welcome to episode number 131 of Gaston's Great, a podcast highlighting some of the great things happening in and around Gaston County. I'm your host, Stephen Long, and we're coming to you once again from the international headquarters of GSM Services. We simply believe in discussing more of the reasons why Gaston's great. We are highlighting another great organization this week as we highlight the Stowe Botanical Garden. We have John Searby with us, who is the executive director. John was also with us way back on episode number 14, almost exactly 3 years ago when we were highlighting the Catawba River Keepers. So we might talk a little bit about that, but I know there's a connection with the two organizations as well. So, John, it's great to have you back on, and welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Appreciate being on here again and being able to talk about why we think we're part of what makes Gaston great.
Well, there's no question that you are, and this is I don't know if it's called an organization, a location. There's so many different things, but most people, I'm sure, have heard of Stowe Botanical. Maybe I don't know if everybody's been out there. I've been fortunate to be out there a couple of times every year for something, a wedding, a community event, or just because we're so involved with so many things. Another recent one was it was a great night out there with Promise for Haiti.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm good buddies with Omer Shed, who is a big part of that organization. So that was another great evening out there, and that's typical of the things that I've seen out there. So before we get into that, I'm gonna ask this question I did ask you 3 years ago, but because I know a lot of things have changed for you personally and professionally. But just if you can, for our listeners, just tell us a little bit about yourself, anything you'd like to share, and then we'll get into talking about the garden.
Yeah, so the 10-cent version of who I am is I grew up in Central Illinois in a small farming community, went to school in Johnson City, Tennessee on a basketball scholarship, and then spent the first 10 years of my professional career as a college basketball coach. Yeah. And that really informed my leadership style. When I kind of worked my way up and was fortunate to be able to be an assistant at Auburn University. The SEC is a tough place to coach, sure. And if you don't win enough games, everybody gets fired. So that happened to us eventually. And
who was the head coach at that time?
Jeff Lebo, who played at Carolina, was my boss, both at Tennessee Tech and at Auburn. And so when we got fired, I had a 1-year-old, and my wife looked at me and said, "Are we going to chase everybody else's kids around the country for the rest of our lives?" Because recruiting can be a grind and a lot of travel. So I transitioned into the corporate world and worked in corporate sponsorship, sales, and marketing, and sold advertising into stadiums and arenas and all kinds of places all around the world. Did that for about 10 years. The company I worked for transferred me here to Charlotte in 2011. And in 2016, we bought a house on Lake Wiley in Belmont and started looking around and saying, who's taking care of this lake, and found Catawba River Keeper. And so 3 years later, in 2019, I decided that I was ready to leave the corporate world, get rid of the suit and tie, get rid of the commute into uptown Charlotte, and was fortunate enough to become the executive director of Catawba River Keeper. And that really started my nonprofit leadership journey. And so I've been in that role with Catawba River Keeper for 5 years. About a year and a half ago, back up, about 2 years ago, the garden had completed kind of a market research study. And it was really coming out of COVID, really thinking about what does the 380 acres of Stowe Botanical Garden want to be when it grows up. Dan Stowe put the property aside in 1992. The garden formally opened in 1999. And so 25 years later, the board felt like it was relevant to take a look and say, are we adhering to Dan's original vision? What do we need to be doing to kind of keep this organization moving? And Catawba River Keeper had moved our headquarters here to Gaston County in 2021. That was part of the reason I was on that podcast 3 years ago. And I think the garden leadership, the board leadership at the garden felt like some of the things we were doing at Riverkeeper around really engaging the community, getting people actively out on the water, having retail locations to tell our story, really leaning into education. Those were things that the board at the garden felt like were needed there as well. So they asked me to join a long-range strategic planning committee, along with several other leaders from Gaston County and Mecklenburg County. And that gave me an opportunity to look under the hood a little bit.
Sure.
We had been going to Stowe since the day we moved here. My wife's a huge gardener. We live 2 miles from the front gate. So it had been a big part of our lives, but I had never really knew how the organization was run. I quite honestly didn't know the breadth of the property or any of that stuff. So through that process, I got to know the board leadership. And then about a year and a half ago, the board leadership at the garden reached out to the board leadership at Riverkeeper and said, hey, would you all be interested in sharing John as a CEO? And that was kind of a big idea. It took a little bit of a time to figure out how that was going to work. We were going to work through that. But in October of last year, we formally executed an MOU for a shared leadership partnership between the two organizations. So now myself and about 4 other leaders are employed by both organizations, and we essentially have brought all the administrative overhead of the two organizations together. So that's kind of the story of how they fit together now and how that came to be. But we're here to talk about the garden today. And I got some exciting things to talk about.
Well, good. So then, and I would assume in that world, that's probably a unique setup, not something that you see occurring very often.
It is. And at the same time, I think it's a trend that you're going to see grow because funders, large foundations, big individual donors, they don't like their money to go to administrative overhead.
Oh, sure.
They want it to go to the mission. And so any way that nonprofits can find to cut administrative overhead is going to be a positive. In our case, you have, an organization at the garden that's built around a core group of scientists, horticulturists, botanists, who are caring for the land that Dan left and making it available to the public. At the Riverkeeper, you have a core group of scientists, hydrologists, biologists, fisheries experts that are caring for the river in the region. And then both organizations have these wraparound services that support those core group of scientists. So when you really start to unpeel the onion a little bit, you realize that the two organizations are more alike than they seem, and they're certainly adjacent to each other. The garden has 2.5 miles of waterfront on Lake Wiley.
Yep.
So it has a vested interest in Lake Wiley staying healthy. We've got about 8 acres of wetlands on the property. We've got almost a mile of streams running through the property. So having the expertise of the Riverkeeper staff support the garden property has really been a benefit, and vice versa. The garden staff is helping the Riverkeeper grow plants for stream restoration and shoreline restoration, and obviously has a huge area of expertise and property to do that, where Riverkeeper doesn't have that kind of resource.
Right. All right. So you mentioned a little bit about the history, Mr. Stowe, and I think I heard you say 1999, which, again, like we were talking before, and I can't believe it's been 3 years since we spoke about the Riverkeeper. It's hard to believe it's 25 years that the garden has been open too, right? It just, I didn't have kids yet, right about the time I started having kids. Wow. So and that story is kind of known in the community, but what was the original, or do you know, the original mission, and what was the plan originally for the garden? Is that a fair question?
Yeah, absolutely. So Dan Stowe, obviously the Stowe family is well known. His father started the Stowe Mills in Belmont. And so Dan and his brothers ran the mills for their fathers afterwards. Dan did not have any children. And so he really had time, energy, and money to invest in other things. And he was very passionate about the land. And so he invested a lot of money in land in Gaston County. And in particular, this 1,400-acre waterfront property that we now all call the Peninsula in Belmont, because it is the way you get down to South Carolina. And so as he was getting older, he married late in life, but he and Aileen, his wife, never had children together. And so, he was thinking about, how do I leave a legacy? And gardening was important to him. Land conservation was important to him. And so in 1992, he transferred 1,400 acres that he owned there on the peninsula in Belmont to the Daniel Stowe Daniel Stowe Conservancy is our official name of our nonprofit. Okay. And so set that land aside, intentionally left some of it to be sold to be able to keep the garden, moving, knowing that the region was likely to grow, and that 1,400 acres would would be a lot of land to manage. So there always was the intent that the 400 acres that we sit on now would be the core part of the garden, and that the other 1,000 acres would be used to make investments back in that property. And his original vision was really populating that with different types of gardens, with lots of hiking trails, with lake access, with educational amenities, with arts and culture amenities. He really envisioned this being one of the finest botanical gardens in the world. And so it was always about more than just formal gardens. In the original master plan, there's an amphitheater for music performances. There's a hotel for overnight accommodations. There's certainly, dozens of formal gardens, but there's an education center. There's a restaurant. There's about a dozen miles of trails in the original master plan. And so his vision was that people could come out and spend the entire day and really enjoy being outdoors. And no matter what their idea of an outdoor experience was, we would have something to offer. Our mission is to inspire a love of nature and its beauty through unforgettable outdoor experiences. Okay. And so when we started thinking about revising that master plan, I recommended, let's go back to 1992 and let's hear Dan's voice through that original master plan. We have a quote up on the wall in our admin building that says, and it's from Dan, it says, there's no greater gift in the world than getting your hands dirty. And I think that really speaks to what we're trying to accomplish at the garden, is we have gone back to that 1992 master plan. And certainly there's things that were relevant then that aren't relevant now. There's certainly things that he could have had no idea that we were going to have 1,200 homes in the McLean neighborhood surrounding us. Yeah. And so we're thinking about it through a 2024 lens instead of a 1992 lens. But much of the vision for where we're going over the next 25 years is rooted back in that original vision, that no matter what you're interested in from an outdoor standpoint, whether it's kayaking, hiking, gardens, getting your kids out and playing, or just enjoying the outdoors, sitting on the banks of a pond, that we're going to be able to offer that to you.
All right. Very good. So that's a lot. So let's go ahead and get into what's, you mentioned, I think the phrase you used, you got a lot to share. So that's kind of the historical point, what got us to here, kind of an overview of kind of what y'all were looking at. But let's talk about some specifics. What is going on? What has changed? If somebody was there 5 years ago or 10 years ago and they haven't been back and they come back for the first time, what's something new they're going to see? Just initiatives, just anything and everything that you can share with us.
Yeah. So if I had $1 for every time in the last 18 months I've heard, it's been 10 years since I've been at the garden, we wouldn't have to do much fundraising. Yeah. I think the garden has been through kind of 3 distinct eras in its life. Dan was alive until 2004. And so while he was alive, he had a very clear vision and hand on that wheel. And it really was about establishing the garden. And anybody who gardens knows that the first phase is always a little painful. The garden sleeps first, and so you have to get the plants in the ground. You have to get things established. And it probably wasn't much to look at in those early years. I wasn't here, but Dan kept that vision moving forward. After Dan passed away, really the garden started to mature in its first phase. And so the original core gardens, the canal garden, which is the beauty shot down from the visitor pavilion, the perennial gardens, which take you out through the tunnel fountain that kids love to run through. Those gardens really started to mature kind of in that middle time range, really between like 2005 and 2018, 2019. The gardens were probably at some of their best when COVID hit. And unfortunately, like a lot of the world, the garden shut down. and it didn't come back as quickly as a lot of other outdoor spaces did. And so we had a lot of deer found their way into the garden and ate up a lot of the plants. We had very little staff managing the plants themselves, and so weeds really took over some things. And so
doesn't take long, does it?
Doesn't take long. I mean, less than a year, and it was totally in trouble. And so if you talk to people who were longtime garden members and then came out in 2021 when we opened back up, it was really a sad state. So over the last 4 or 5 years, we've been focused on rebuilding that.
Gotcha.
And so to answer your question more directly, I think if people came out today who had not been there for 3 years or 5 years or 7 years, they would be pleasantly surprised with how it's regrown. We've used all the same infrastructure, but we came in and did totally new plantings in every single bed in the entire garden. So everything was stripped down to the dirt, replanted, and we really are back in that sleep, creep, leap phase. And so the sleep year was 2021, and a little bit into 2022. 2023 was kind of our creep year. We started to see some things start to come to life. This summer, for the first time, we're really starting to leap out, and plants that maybe felt like there was dead space between them, now they're in full bloom and really filling in the beds that they were intended for. So I think from a garden standpoint, we're back to some of that really fine presentation in the 2015 to 2020 range pre-COVID that we had. The new things that we're really bringing on board now are really trying to reimagine that full use of the 380 acres. And so we've invested in about 1.5 miles of new trails, and we've connected all those trails to our trailhead store. If folks have been out there, they would have seen a log cabin up near South New Hope Road. It was originally the garden store. Yep. And it sat vacant for a long time. We used it for different things, education, for offices. But last year, we reimagined it as a trailhead store. And we connected all 7 miles of trails on the property to that trailhead. So you can park there, you can hop out, you can take your dog for a walk, you can get back to that trailhead store on a 3-mile loop, on a 5-mile loop. And we've got coffee and breakfast snacks and salads and sandwiches and wraps and beer and wine and sodas, and all of it is outside the formal garden, so it's all free of charge. And so it's a place that the public can come, enjoy our trails, enjoy being outdoors, and if they decide that the formal garden is not something they want to do that day, that's fine. They can still have a great experience. So that's really the newest thing that we've put on the ground.
Yeah, I saw that in between visits when I had been. It'd been a long enough period of time where I saw that.
Yeah, and it was hiding in the trees for a long time. We uncovered it. Now, as soon as you drive in, you can't miss it now.
So can you access that from New Hope, or do you have to drive in, right, to access that?
It actually has its own entrance right off New Hope Road.
Okay.
You can get there by coming in the main entrance as well. But it has its own entrance, and it's open 7 days a week, 7 a.m. And then depending on the day, during the week we close at 7. On the weekends we stay open until 9.
Okay, very good. All right, so I'm again being familiar with the garden, being out there so many times in 25 years. Maybe what's a typical week? What kind of events? What kind of things are going on out at the garden? I'm not because I know week to week it just changes. But what some of our listeners may be like, I haven't heard anything. Yeah, sure, I'd like to get some coffee. But why else? What would bring somebody who's never been out there, and let them understand what's going on week to week and what might bring them out there? Now, I heard food, coffee, and beer. That's a pretty good reason.
Yeah, that's certainly a draw. But I think first and foremost, the garden has always been and always will be our crown jewel. The botanical gardens are the unique part of the property, and it's the thing that you can't find anywhere else in the Charlotte region. It's what makes us a regional attraction, not just a Gaston County attraction, because without the garden, we would just be another big park, and there's big parks all over the place.
Sure.
But the garden really offers a unique experience for people. What a lot of people don't think about is I hear all the time, well, I'm not really a garden person. And I say, well, do you like beauty? Do you like peace? How long has it been since you've been in a place where you couldn't see a house or couldn't hear a car? And you can do that inside the garden. And so a typical week, during the week, we're open Tuesday through Sunday from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. for the public. And so we have general admissions, people coming in. Some people are members and they get an annual pass, and so they can come in anytime they want. But our daily admission is very reasonable. You can bring a family of four for under $60 and spend the entire day. Inside the garden, you've got stuff for kids. We've got the Lost Hollow Children's Garden, which is a place that we've intentionally curated so that parents don't have to worry about their kids, quote unquote, messing up a fancy plant. There's no fancy plants in the children's garden. There's lots of play spaces. There's a merry-go-round. There's rocks to jump off of. There's, a pond to throw rocks into. It's just a kid's playground, and it's set up so that parents can sit down and tell their kids, hey, go enjoy yourself, and not have to worry about them getting into trouble or getting, messing something up. There's nothing that can be messed up in the children's garden. And then there's the Orchid Conservatory, which is probably one of the most unique experiences at the garden. It stays a constant 75 to 80 degrees in there. So in the winter, it's a great place to go experience in the winter because you come in out of the cold into this warm tropical environment. In the summer, it can exacerbate that. It gets very humid, but not only beautiful orchids, but lots of other tropical plants in there. Very humid, warm, rich environment. And then, I think even for people who don't like plants, there's not that many places where you can stand and be quiet or sit on a bench and stare at a fountain or a waterfall and let the sound of the water just kind of relax you. There's a lot of studies that tell us that being close to water, and particularly moving water, can bring your blood pressure down, can improve your mental health. And one of my favorite things to do, and I do this at least once a week when I do a garden walk each week with our director of horticulture. And, I always want to just sit next to one of our fountains because they all have unique sounds because of the size or the size of the pool or the way the water moves. And I just think, whether you like plants or not, go out there and sit and enjoy the sounds of the water out there. And if you're so inclined, you have time, walk on down to the lake. We've got trails that take you right to the lakefront, and you can and see Lake Wiley and enjoy the beauty of the lake.
Yeah, we live in such a high-paced world, right? Also, so that almost disconnecting opportunity to disconnect here, but not far from home.
That's right.
And I also would assume that's why so many apps and noise machines are running water or something, right? Because it is a soothing. I'm not sure soothing is the right word, but that's I'm sure it's one of the reasons put a hammock out there, so you might have people sleeping out there.
Yeah, that's not uncommon. We have people bring a blanket and sit and read, and next thing you know, they're dozing off under a tree.
Good for them. So, and I know you haven't been there, a real long time in the grand scheme, but is there something that stands out, John, since you've been there that you're most proud of seeing accomplished, or maybe an event or just something that stands out in your time since you've been there that you go, wow, this reminds me of why I decided to do this, or it really hits the mission of the garden?
Yeah, I would answer that in two ways. I think one thing that a lot of people don't know is the variety of opportunities we have. So we were talking before we started, a lot of people have had a wedding experience there. Either they've had their wedding there, they've attended a wedding there. We have dozens of weddings every year at the garden, and there's lots of different styles of weddings. A lot of people that I talk to say, oh, I could never afford to get married at the garden. Well, depending on what kind of ceremony you want, we probably can hit a price point for just about anybody. Certainly there's these huge formal, garden weddings that can get pricey. But we have a lot of little quiet, private spaces for smaller weddings during the week, things like that. And that always surprises me that people who get creative about how to engage in the garden can come up with a lot of interesting and unique ways.
Right.
Corporate events, we have, Christmas parties. A lot of Christmas parties happen out there during our holiday lights. It's a great place for a company Christmas party. We have a lot of fundraisers. You mentioned the Promise for Haiti fundraiser. Yes. It's really important to us to be good community partners with other nonprofits and make sure that we're making our space available to them to be able to support the work that they do. And so we have special nonprofit pricing for nonprofits in the region. And sometimes that means they might have to have their event on a Tuesday night instead of a Saturday.
Right.
But it allows an opportunity for folks to raise money for their event. So I think that variety of events is one thing that's really stood out to me. I didn't recognize that. The other thing is just the importance of showing people how plants are an indicator for the overall ecosystems. So we have a lot of native species. We have a lot of non-native species to North Carolina at the garden. But if you take the time to slow down and you look closely at plants, you always see bugs flitting around. You see a bee, getting into a plant. You see a ground squirrel running around. You might see, we have a deer fence up around the entire formal garden. You might see deer wandering around outside the deer fence. And I think when you're at a place like the garden and you can slow down from your busyness, you start to see things that you don't normally see. One of our really cool experiences right now is we have a woman who on Saturday mornings is doing what's called forest bathing. And it's not like going out in the forest and taking a shower. It's immersing yourself in nature.
Okay.
And what her program is all about is slowing down enough to be aware of what's going on. And I'm guilty of it as much as anybody. You get in your car, you're ripping from one place to another, you're grabbing gas, you're getting dinner, you're trying to get everything done.
Yeah.
And you're probably driving right by all this stuff. And so when you get to the garden, there's nothing but slow down time for you. I would tell people, if they're listening to this and they say, we need to go out and visit, give yourself enough time. Don't try to shoehorn a visit to the garden into an hour and a half on a Saturday morning where you're coming from the kids' soccer game. In between
soccer games,
yeah. That's not the way to experience it. The way to experience it is we're going to go grab some lunch at the Trailhead store, and then we're going to go spend the whole afternoon in the garden and give ourselves time to just wander, because I don't think we have enough wandering time in our lives these days. And that's really the thing that's special about it. It was special in 1999, but Gaston County's changed a heck of a lot since 1999.
That area specifically.
And we think that our property is going to become more valuable to the community as it continues to grow. And our residents in Gaston County and beyond are looking for more places to disconnect and get away from the hustle and bustle. So that's really what's special to me, is just that there's no agenda. The garden has no agenda. The garden has there's no guided tour of the garden. We'll give you a map, and we've got good interpretation of what things are. And, everybody who's into gardening has the apps that tell them what plants are and things like that. But you don't have to do anything there. You can do everything or do nothing, and it's still a great experience.
That's good. So, you mentioned earlier about, and I know it's more of a, frankly, it's a regional, location, right? I mean, what kind of groups do you have coming in from out of town, schools, or just maybe touch on that, some of the educational part, and then also just what kind of groups and how often does that kind of stuff happen?
Yeah, one thing a lot of people don't know, if they've traveled in and out of Charlotte, they've heard the Charlotte's got a lot. That's the tagline for the Charlotte Regional Visitor Authority. The Daniel Stowe Botanical Garden is the only entity that is supported by the Charlotte CRVA that is not in Mecklenburg County.
Okay.
And I think that speaks volumes to our importance to the region. If the Charlotte Visitor Authority thinks that Stowe Botanical Garden in Belmont, North Carolina is important to the region for visitorship, then we are. And certainly Gaston County Travel and Tourism also highly values us. So we see visitors, our core visitorship is probably Raleigh to Atlanta, Asheville to Charleston.
Okay.
That's kind of that
makes sense.
If you ran a list of zip codes of every visitor, probably 85% of them would fall into that group. But we also are part of the American Public Gardens Association, which has reciprocal membership with about 150 gardens all around the country.
Okay.
So what that means is there's a niche group of people who are kind of, for lack of a better word, garden collectors. You know, you hear people say like, I got a bucket list. I want to go to every Major League Baseball park.
Sure.
There's people who have a bucket list to go to every single botanical garden in the United States. And those members at Powell Gardens in Kansas City or Cheekwood Gardens in Nashville or Longwood Gardens in California, they can get into our garden for free through their membership at that garden, and vice versa. Our members who maybe are up in New York and visit the Brooklyn Botanical Garden, or are out in Kansas City and visit Powell Garden, they can go for free. And so I'd say that last 15% are those people. It's these like die-hard garden enthusiasts coming from all over the country, and they may be making a southeastern tour and hitting the NC Arboretum and the Stowe Botanical Garden and the Atlanta Botanical Garden, and making a whole vacation out of it. And so it's interesting to talk to those people. We actually get ideas from them. They'll say, hey, this display that I just saw down in Atlanta, you guys might think about. And so we'll go and visit. I'm actually taking a visit later this summer to Powell Gardens in Kansas City and Cheekwood Gardens in Nashville, because they're doing some things right now that we think would be appropriate for us. And we don't really compete with them, right? Like, not that many people from Nashville are coming here and vice versa. So it's an interesting mix of visitors. We have a lot of school groups. In about 6 weeks, there's going to be school buses in our parking lot every single day. A lot of the things that we talk about with ecology, with botany, fit into particularly a middle school curriculum. And so almost every Gaston County kid is going to come to the garden at some point during their career. We have a lot of retiree bus tours. So these bus tours that go and go for 5 or 6 days, and they hit a lot of different sites. We get a lot of those during the week. And then on the weekends, it's mostly families. It's mostly, one unique thing about the garden is we're a 3-generation experience. So grandma and grandpa can join their kids and their grandkids, and there's really something for everybody to do. And so maybe grandma and grandpa want to go explore the orchid conservatory by themselves while the parents and kids run through the children's garden, and then they meet up for lunch. And so we really
Dad is off getting a beer at the.
That's right. Yeah, and we keep keep everybody happy and help everybody relax.
Just kidding.
So that 3-generation experience,
Absolutely.
We see a lot of that on the weekends, and families from really the entire Charlotte region coming out and seeing us.
At the peak of the garden, I don't know if you could call it a peak since COVID, because again, as you mentioned, do you have any typical numbers in a year's time of visitors or?
Yeah, last year we had a little over 100,000 visitors over the course of the year, and about 30,000 of those were between Thanksgiving and Christmas. Our holiday lights display is really fantastic. We invest very heavily in it. It is a ticketed event every single night of the week, and we do a lot of special activities around it. We have a 5K race that you get to run through the garden lights. We've got family nights. We've got Santa out there. All the stuff going on that you expect out of a lights display, and so about 30% of our total visitorship comes between Thanksgiving and New Year's, and it's gotten to the point where we now do time ticketing. So you have to make a reservation online ahead of time, and you're slotted into either an early time slot that starts, I think, is 5 to 7:30, or the late time slot, which is 7:30 to 10. And so, Holiday Lights is if there's listeners who haven't been to Holiday Lights, then they need to just plan on it right now, because it's a must see and must do activity in the whole Charlotte region.
Yeah, very good. All right. So, talked about a lot of things, John. I appreciate you sharing. So looking ahead. I mean, you mentioned a little bit about some plans, but maybe not real specific. Is there, you're looking ahead the next, that classic question, the next 5 to 10 years. I don't know that that's a fair time frame for something like the garden, but are there any plans in the future specific? Or are you just trying to grow, get back to pre-COVID type of operations, or just anything you can share about the future with the organization?
Yeah, I'm gonna ask you to let me come back next spring because we're working really hard on finalizing a property master plan.
Okay.
And we're going to be ready to announce that to the public in spring of next year. And so that's going to be really a 10-year plan of how the property is going to change and mature over the next decade. It's going to include certainly new and enhanced gardens, but other opportunities, other amenities on the property. We're really working hard to rebuild our board of directors. Our board of directors has been a longtime board, mostly family members of the Stowe family and close family friends.
Sure.
And they've been working at it a long time, 25 years. And so they have a desire to really bring in more community members into the board.
Okay.
So we're working on some governance things that we're going to be ready to announce in the spring. We're working on refreshing our brand and, a new look and feel for the brand, which is always something that, is needed in an organization that's 25 years old.
Oh, sure.
And has had the same logo since day one.
We're familiar with that. Yes.
Yeah. You guys have been through that recently, right?
Yeah.
So, all that stuff is going to be ready to be rolled out next spring. And so I'm going to hold my cards a little bit to the vest.
Fair enough.
But I would tease out to people that you should come out and see the garden this year and then be prepared to be excited about where it's going to go starting in early 2025.
Okay. Yeah, that might be a good time to to get an update there and maybe revisit the Riverkeeper too at the same time. So I appreciate that. So before we shift gears here, is there anything I haven't asked that I should have asked? I mean, obviously, before we're finished, we'll make sure our listeners know where to find information out, any events that are coming up, anything special like that before we finish. But anything I haven't asked that I should have asked?
I think the only thing I would mention is that membership and support of the organization from a philanthropic standpoint is vitally important to us.
Sure.
One thing that I talk a lot in Gaston County in particular about is, the fact that the Stowe name is attached to our organization sometimes leads people to believe that we have a money tree out back and we just go pluck it off whenever we need it.
Yeah.
Dan was very generous to give us the land and gave us support to get things off the ground. But our ongoing support from our endowment only makes up 5 to 6% of our annual revenue. So we really rely on individual donors, community partners, admissions, visitors to really run the garden. And I think the thing that I've been most shocked about in my year and a half at the helm is how expensive it is to run a 380 acre property with a 15 acre botanical garden. And it's not something, unfortunately, there's no AI solution for it. It is hands and feet and people. And so people cost money. And so the way we're
getting the hands dirty, as you mentioned
that's right.
at the beginning.
The way we're going to grow is getting more hands and getting more hands dirty, whether that's people coming out and volunteering. We have tons of volunteer opportunities. Every week we call it Weeding Wednesday. So if people, don't have their own garden at home, but they love gardening, we'll put them to work. They can help us mulch beds and weed beds and get new plantings in the ground. And those are important. Those are just as important as donations. But both ways of supporting the organization are really important to us.
Yeah. Well, listen, it's obviously a gem here. That's a GEM here for Gaston County, and so I appreciate that. That was a question that I would hope you would share about how to help support the organization. So. You may not remember this, but 3 years ago, John, we had these Gaston County round of questions that we always ask. But since you've been here before, I just completely made up some new ones.
Okay.
All right. And we're going to call this the garden speed round of questions because, I'm so creative. So you got a whole new team too, right, at the garden now who's going to want to know the answer to all these questions.
Yeah.
So what's your favorite movie?
That's a really hard one. I probably answered that last time with Hoosiers because...
Actually, I didn't ask you that question the first time around.
Okay.
These are new questions.
All right. Well, I was recently reminded that one of my favorite movies is Shawshank Redemption.
Okay, that's a good movie. Yeah.
Anytime it like comes on when you're flipping channels,
have to stop.
I'm going to stop. And we just happened to. My kids had never seen it. They're teenagers now, so it's appropriate for them to watch it. And we watched it as a family this week, and I love that movie.
That's another one that's surprising. Most people wouldn't connect that with a Stephen King story.
Yeah.
Yeah, but actually some of his best movies were actually his non-horror stuff, and Shawshank is really, really good, so I appreciate that. But Hoosiers is that's an excellent, especially for a basketball guy.
That kept me motivated growing up.
Yeah. I mean, that is that's a good one. How about, it's a similar question, how about a recent show or anything you or your family have streamed recently? Series or anything?
This one's taking it way back. We just started watching as a family Twin Peaks.
Oh, wow.
Which was
David Lynch.
The first miniseries on network television. Is still the most popular miniseries of all time, I learned. So we watched the first 2 episodes last night, actually.
That's an interesting show.
Yeah. I forgot how weird it was, actually.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, I kind of like that kind of stuff.
But it was made for network television, so it's not as... certainly not as graphic or violent.
It's relatively safe,
as you would see now
for younger kids. Yeah. Streaming something like, if it was remade on something like Netflix, I'm sure it would not be small child appropriate.
Not at all.
How about favorite memory as a child?
My favorite memory as a child is bird hunting with my grandfather. I grew up in a small farming community in Illinois. My grandfather and my uncles were all big bird hunters, and so. Walking through fields in Illinois and stirring up wild pheasant is a pretty cool experience that doesn't happen a lot anymore.
Sure.
But that's really where my love of nature started, was in the bird field with my grandfather.
Oh, that's terrific. How about I did ask you this question before, but how about a recent book or blog or article or podcast or something that you could recommend to our listeners?
The book I'm reading right now is called Callous Town, and I don't even know the author off the top of my head. It's callous, like the word callous, and then town, all one word. It's a fictional story about a small town in South Carolina, and it's all these different interesting characters that are living in this town in South Carolina that is dying, and they all have interesting experiences about that. And I'm really interested in the human experience, and to see it through the lens of this small town, which is not totally unlike the places I grew up, is kind of fun.
Well, good. Listen, I appreciate you indulging us on some of those local questions. So, the big question that I asked you the first time, and I'm going to change it, is what would you tell yourself about your 20? What advice would you give your 20-year-old self? But we're not going to. If you want to hear that, you can go back to episode 14 and hear what John said that day. But I'm going to switch it up a little bit. So, if you could have coffee with one historical figure, who would it be and why?
Oh boy, that's a good question. I'm going to go with Teddy Roosevelt. I recently read a book about Teddy Roosevelt before he really became famous, kind of his path to the presidency. And, Teddy Roosevelt was not the kindest human, but he found a way to kind of work through some challenges that he had personally to really have some really tremendous impact. He's the father of the national parks. Yep. He was a great outdoorsman.
It's almost like he lived multiple lives when you read about him, the time he spent out west versus New York and getting to the presidency. I mean, and
definitely.
To charge up San Juan Hill, or the Rough Riders. Yeah, it's really. I mean, I've read several books about him, so he's a terrific character.
And I would, I think it's interesting to think about how flawed people can still do amazing things.
Yeah.
And that's really comforting to me when I see my own flaws and I'm pointing my own finger at myself, that we can still overcome those things and have impact in our world. And I'd love to talk to him and kind of find out I'd love to hear him reflect on his own life.
Yeah. And, if you I would encourage readers to go read about him or find a podcast or something about historical podcast about his life, because he overcame a lot too. But yeah, he was also very ambitious.
Yeah.
To your point, about maybe not the nicest guy. So, John, I appreciate all this. I appreciate your time. Appreciate the work you're doing at the garden. So, as always, the main point is to bring awareness, get you some visitors. That's the point of the reason that we do this podcast. So, where can listeners go to find more information out? See if there's any events coming up. They want to find out about the timing on the Christmas lights and all that kind of stuff. Where can listeners go? Yeah, so the website is DSBG, Daniel Stowe Botanical Garden .org, dsbg.org. And certainly, like everybody, follow us on Facebook, Instagram. Sure. That's where the most up-to-date information is. And then the website has just got, a wealth of information. It does. I was spent some time on there yesterday. Yeah. So yeah, it was great. Yeah, it is a great site. Yeah. Hit the website, follow us on socials, and just come out to the garden for a visit. Set aside a Saturday afternoon and come see us. All right. Any last words before we close this episode out? Just appreciate you guys doing this. Have raised my family here in Gaston County. It's a great place to live, and any chance that I get to bang the drum for Gaston County, I'm going to do it. Well, I appreciate that. Well, when you're executive director of two, excellent organizations, you've got your hands in a lot of things. So, I appreciate that as well. So, as I typically do, I'm going to do my own book recommendation and kind of quote and thought for the week. And my book recommendation is by an author named Andy Armstrong. One of my mentors who recommended this book to me, he's probably maybe a couple years ago, but this is something my wife wishes I probably wouldn't do. I've got so many books that in my queue, but I finally got around to read this one within the last few months. But it's called The Grace Arsenal. It's a business book, but it's just reminds us about the whole concept of grace and how that can be utilized in business. Sometimes we think maybe you can't, but and as a Methodist, grace is a huge concept and should be a huge concept in my life. Maybe not as much as it should be, but it's an interesting book and one that I would recommend. And then my thought for the week. I'm staying in the business world here, but Stephen Covey wrote a terrific book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. But something that comes from that, so I think that was an early book recommendation from me, but he said, most people do not listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply, which, man, I know when I was younger, boy, that was like my MO was, will you be quiet so I can answer and tell you how much I know, instead of really listening to understand. Another way he words it is seek to understand before being understood. So I think that concept might help with a lot of our communication in the world we're currently living in. I think too many times we want everybody to understand us and before we want to try to understand others. So again, thank you for indulging me on that book recommendation and that quote. And as always, thanks so much to our listeners for taking the time to listen to today's episode. Please spread the word if you can about the podcast, and please don't hesitate to contact us at our email address, which is podcast@gastonsgreat.com. We're always looking for suggestions for future podcast topics and guests. You can find the podcast and subscribe at the website, gastonsgreat.com, or anywhere you listen to podcasts. Please follow us on all our social media platforms, and please give us a good 5-star rating as it helps the podcast get noticed. Thanks again to John for being our guest today. Gaston's Great is produced and brought to you by Naomi Hunt and Amy Anderson from GSM Services. I'm your host, Stephen Long. Thanks again for hanging out with us, and please keep coming back to hear more reasons why Gaston's great.